Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Thompson. It's really great to be back doing community meetings in person. It's great to be in Milan, and the weather here has been absolutely fantastic. And I have the privilege, and we have the privilege of having Dan Farr here today. He's going to be taking all the hard content. So I get to kind of sit back, let Dan take all the hard explanations and trying to bring everyone into the fold of what are containers, container orchestration, and even more so container orchestration tools. So it's a long title, but we'll get into it. We got to start off with something light. If we're going to get into something as kind of dense as containers, we need to start off with something light. So we are talking about containers today, guaranteed. We're going to talk about orchestration, and we're going to talk about tools. But obviously, nothing on the screen pertains to the context today. It's going to be much more interesting, obviously, relative to the payments ecosystem, and it's going to apply to the folks in this room. So without further ado, I'd like to have Dan go over the agenda for today.
Thank you. At this point, we should identify the topics of the presentation, and in this session, we'll be providing an overview and brief history of the special interest groups, often referred to as SIGs, and as well as an overview of the SIG development process and what we went through in creating the documentation, as well as identification of some of the goals for SIG within our industry. A brief overview of the results of this year's SIG effort and the paper that we've put together, and we'll also touch on the 2023 SIG process and what to expect in that coming year.
So a little bit of history. There's going to be a theme today, and it's that this is community-driven. These special interest groups, these SIGs that we're going to be talking about today, they are absolutely dependent on the community, and you're going to hear this theme repeated throughout the presentation today. And that's from folks sitting in this room. So a little bit of history. We started back in 2010, over a dozen, at least a dozen, documents that are developed from previous SIGs. I'll mention this again, but I have led 2 SIGs in the past. I didn't lead the SIG that we're going to talk about today. That was Joel Weiss. But I have led 2 SIGs in the past. If you actually go out to the PCI SSC website, we have something over, I think, 60 guidance documents if you go to the guidance tab. And a number of those, again, are from special interest groups and the content that they produced. So very important. And obviously, and we'll get more into this today, this is all developed by the community, folks like Dan, folks like yourself. And so this most definitely is relevant to the payments industry, to the payments ecosystem.
And I'm glad you talk about developing resources as well, because if I take it back to when I started as a QSA, I came from an environment that was very physical prior to looking at virtualization. So the first SIG paper I ever touched and looked at was the SIG paper back in 2011 that looked at virtualization. It helped me to understand what virtualization was and how it could be applied into the payments industry, the different types of virtualization that would be in use, and then the risks that were associated to those. And then secondly, a more recent SIG document, the penetration testing guidance. Again, that was really helpful in not understanding what penetration testing is. Obviously, as a QSA, you'd hope that that's something that I'm familiar with. But in terms of setting the expectation and the requirements for internal and external testing, what it is that the requirements actually are supposed to mean for the organization. And that helps set the expectations with management around what the pen test should be, what the results should be, and what the financial implications of that are to the organization, the cost of control. And positioning penetration testing as a benefit to the organization, how that plays out to your organization, and then moving it away from just another one of the compliance costs or controls.
So a little bit about the process. So again, this is, and I'm gonna put a plug in now, and I'm gonna revisit this right before we end. But we actually have the process for the 2023 SIG happening right now, and I'll talk more about that just before we end. But if you haven't participated before, we highly encourage you to do so. If you go out to the PCI SSC website, and you go to the Get Involved and Special Interest Groups, you'll see all the requisite information there, FAQs, how to participate, etc. So we do encourage you to do that. So it first starts off, and what you would see on that page is with a proposal from the community. Again, this is community-driven. It's member-driven. I'll keep revisiting that through the day. And that's for all eligible participants, and there's a whole list of them, but participating organizations, all the folks from the assessor community are eligible to participate in these special interest groups. And then what will actually conclude, I believe 28th of October, is we'll get into then the selection of those proposals in determining which topics will actually go forward for the election process. And then once that topic is chosen, then the participating organizations and the council, et cetera, will look at how do we create objectives from that. That's something that Dan's been through as well. And so the group will start to assemble. We'll create a terms of reference. What do we want out of that special interest group that was essentially assembled? And from that topic, and trying to determine what are the potential deliverables as that SIG discusses and meets and tries to create content around that topic. It's going to be useful for the payments industry. And then lastly, it's, again, developed through an iterative process as those SIG members meet, as they discuss, they go through revising content, and ultimately generally results in, again, one of those over a dozen documents that you'll see on the council website. So who's actually involved? So again, one of the constituent elements here, without question, are the SIG members, the community participants. They drive the whole thing. That generally consists of subject matter experts, such as Dan. And I do also want to emphasize something else. Doesn't have to be a subject matter expert. If you want to show up, proactively participate in the dialogue in this topic, if you have questions that you can ask or real-world experience that can help drive those discussions, drive that content forward, that's very useful. And so Dan, as being a member of the SIG we're going to be talking about today, it'd be great if you could share your experiences being part of the process.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess, as I mentioned earlier, the first SIG I was involved in and touched on was the 2011 virtualization process. And the knowledge transfer from just reading the document is immense, and the thought process that goes into it you can see. And it's that growth, both personally and professionally, that can start to help to understand not just the new technology, but how it's deployed in the payments industry, the uses in payment industry. And that point that you made about everyone being involved, there's technical knowledge, and that comes from all members of the group. There's payment industry specific perspectives as well. Whilst containers and containerization are not brand new technologies, the adoptions of them into the payment industry is typically behind what we see in terms of bleeding edge technology. So you've got that perspective of understanding how do we use that within the industry, and then the business implementation scenarios, the drivers from the industry as to why we would choose those tools and techniques when we're talking specifically around the containers and containerization platforms. So the SIG team was comprised of multiple people, multiple disciplines, not just QSAs, not just the SSC, the brands, it's everybody, and the participating organizations really help in that. The benefit of working with the council means that the technology providers were also present during those calls as well, so we got to understand a little bit more from their perspectives, and to build the professional networks and the contacts that you can use in terms of understanding how you can reach out to people within the industry to get guidance further. The group's moderated by the council, obviously, and Joel did a fantastic job in keeping those conversations on track and making sure that the focus of the group pertains specifically to those terms of reference, and we stuck to trying to make sure we met the goal. We'd make contributions to the drafts, so you start off with a blank page, and we built that document over time through meetings where we all got on the call, we shared the document virtually, and then we all participated, we added sections, we took it away, we reviewed, updated, and then came back to discuss it further. And then when we got to the end of the process, just like in my QSA life, we were subject to QA and technical authoring as well, which, you know, fortunately, I'm used to that process, so it worked for us. And then when the document's published, it's nice to see your footprint there as well, to see something, to see a positive message that we've given out, and to see something that the community can use.
So as Dan mentioned, we do have, in addition to the SIG members, someone from the council will chair. I've done it in the past. This one we're talking about today was done by Joe Weiss. And then we also have internally participation by the payment brands and internal committees to go through the approval process, review process to get it published. So again, this is a collaborative effort. That's really what if I have to emphasize one thing, a collaborative effort with that payments community and those that are participating in the SIG. It's addressing issues important to the community because it's essentially brought forth by the community in that overall SIG proposal and election process. Experience-based input, again, I'll keep calling on Dan to have those out there in the real world, boots on the ground, if you will, that are contributing their real world experience and subject matter expertise to the topic. And it's also an opportunity for everyone to provide that direct input into something that, generally speaking, will get published by the council that's out there for the payments community. So let's talk a little bit about that community, and given that you were part of it, again, can you just talk about your motivation of participating in the SIG process?
Absolutely, yeah. So prior to joining the SIG working group, I'd actually worked with a client that were talking to me about containers, container orchestration, and how they were proposing to implement that within their environments. And whilst I was proficient in understanding the technology and the platforms, that implementation within the industry I hadn't necessarily seen too much of. And then understanding what were the requirements and how do PCI DSS requirements apply to that technology that's going to be in use. And whilst that knowledge is there, I think it helped to further understand that the things that I was talking about were right with the client, but also helped me understand and identify new perspectives, new threats, new vulnerabilities that the client would need to address as part of their project. And I think that's where, if I take it to my role at Foregenix, so as the PCI DSS practice lead, it's my responsibility to make sure that my team and the consulting community that we have are prepared and ready to talk to our customers and assess our customers based on the technologies implemented within their environment. And that's where, being involved in this, we can see what's coming, we can understand those threats, that landscape, and then start to apply that to the DSS controls. And when we look at the SIG output paper, I think that's something that you're going to see is whilst we don't directly reference PCI controls, you can draw the line between the suggested controls that are part of the document and the existing requirements within this version of the DSS and the future versions of the DSS. And when I saw this SIG topic, I just needed to be involved in it. I thought it was going to add value to Foregenix and our team. And I guess Foregenix actively support the SSC through gear, through being involved in the SIG groups, feeding back on all of the standards, the RFC processes. So if you're going to be involved, then I think you need to be all in as well. And I think that's where the real benefit for companies to provide and have a voice within this community, that's what being part of the SIG can do.
So again, I can just corroborate everything Dan said. Having chaired 2 SIGs in the past, it's absolutely just the immense value and importance of the SIG members and their participation, and just the dialogues that happen and facilitate. The most recent one I did was for cloud cryptographic services. I've done one for third parties, and just great to have that kind of collaboration across the payments ecosystem from just bringing all sorts of perspectives from the SIG members. So again, I did mention Dan's going to do all the hard work today. So to the actual SIG and the topic at hand, which was guidance for containers and container orchestration tools, I'm going to let Dan explain all of that for you. So.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think when we started out on this process, the first thing we identified was that we needed to provide a background. So we laid the guidance that we were producing on solid foundations, and we built up from there. So we started with the textbook definition of containers and container orchestration tools, as well as then looking at the problems that the industry would be experiencing that required the use of those technologies. So we looked at the dependencies of applications and how that sits within the organizations, and then scalability, how do payments service providers, merchants, scale solutions within their environment to meet their needs. And that's one of the problems that containers can specifically help to solve. So prior to container platforms, the way we used to run our applications is that one application needed an operating system and supporting software to run. and another application needs a different set of operating systems and supporting software to run. With containers at play, each application gets exactly what it needs to run within the environment, and it's contained within that specific boundary. For the second problem, scalability, if we rewind back to operating systems and traditional virtualization that I talked about before, containers can provide a level of abstraction away from that allows for process isolation that is at least similar to hypervisor-based virtualization technologies, but where it might take minutes to bring up a new virtual server, it's then even longer to configure that server and apply the controls, and that can be very expensive when you need more capacity. A new container, on the other hand, can be brought up within usually seconds, if not. And then container orchestration tools provide a framework for managing containers and the container platform, and microservices architectures at scale. Having one is easy, having hundreds requires some level of orchestration to make sure it's consistently deployed in the right way with the controls and the allocations that you want. That's the benefit of containers. It has to be the same over and over again, and that's where the use of container orchestration tools can really help. When you use container orchestration tools, you'll typically describe the configuration in a configuration file, and then the configuration tells the management tool where to find the container images, how to establish the network, and where to store the logs for that system. When deploying new containers, the container management tool automatically schedules the deployment to a cluster and finds the right host, taking into account any defined requirements or restrictions. And those requirements or restrictions can be defined differently, and maybe security controls or processes as well. Getting the controls in early into your container journey will make it easier, as we talked about with PCI for a long time. Prior to getting into a project, establish the security requirements, document those as your acceptance criteria, and make sure that the project is delivering on those. And that's where making sure container orchestration tools are included in your control environment can really help.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Just great information, and really just a quick overcap. What was the purpose, right?
Absolutely.
So we wanted to explain what containers are. Obviously, we wanted to explain what container orchestration tools, but really the crux of it is what are the best practices and what are some security considerations. And one of the salient aspects of that were some use cases and threat models that we'll talk about. But why don't you talk about the result?
Yeah, absolutely. So what did we do? First of all, we realized that we had to focus on establishing that baseline level of knowledge to ensure that the reader had a basic understanding of what we were talking about. And to that end, we included foundational information for containers and container orchestration tools, a glossary, an explanation of the architecture, the advantages and the disadvantages of using this technology, and even some insight into when possibly to not use containers and container orchestration tools. First of all, we realized that we had to focus on establishing that level of baseline knowledge, that glossary that we talked about, the explanation of the architecture, the advantages and the disadvantages, and some insight into when possibly not to use those.
And really, as Dan and Joel and the other SIG participants were going through this process, they realized we don't just want a generic list, we want actual salient, tangible content within this document. And again, really that's what are these security considerations, these threat scenarios, these use cases. And let's look at some of the different sections actually from the document.
Absolutely. So here, we have just one diagram from the document to give you an explanation of containers. The purpose of that diagram is purely to contrast and compare container-based deployments to something more familiar, the bare metal and hypervisor-based computing. And it's this kind of insight from our stakeholders conducted through discussions during our SIG meetings, and most significantly from those members who did not have a strong background in the technology, that enabled us to table and tailor the contents to meet the requirements of the payment card industry. The guidance is built on solid foundations and is digestible by all.
And again, I was talking about these threat cases, or threat scenarios, these use cases, best practices. This is an extract of a table from the document, and I encourage folks to go download it and look at it. This actually comprises about 11 pages. So given it's only 44 pages in length, this is greater than 25% of the actual document. And again, you could see the column for the threats that are outlined, the best practices associated with those threats, as well as the enumerated use cases within this table inside the document. Let's go through some of those use cases, an example if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So the guidance document then goes one step further to provide a description and examples of each use case and even example threat scenarios or attack vectors, including best practice controls to illustrate how the application of this guidance can help within an environment. In the excerpt provided here, we see a description of the use case, a graphic representation of the relationship between elements in the use case, an example threat scenario, and the suggested controls to mitigate that threat.
So similar to the use cases, we also enumerate within the document the threat scenarios, as you see, along with those associated best practices. And those actually tie back to that table that I mentioned earlier. So again, please do go download it and look through it. And that does comprise a majority of the actual document. Again, wanting to provide that real-world experience, that tangible content, rather than just sort of a generic list of best practices or security considerations. So in order to summarize here, this is useful to a diverse set of stakeholders, and that's also contributed to by the fact that we have such a diverse set of folks that do participate in these SIGs. And it does obviously provide the background on container orchestration tools, as Dan went over. It has best practices, as we mentioned, within that table on these threats that are enumerated, as well as real-world use cases, which, again, I think is part of the most tangible aspect of the guidance document that was created. And so really quick, just on the 2023 SIG process that I mentioned earlier, that is happening now. Please go to the website. Again, get involved, special interest groups. You'll have all the information there at your fingertips. It starts off with a proposal. That's going to end October 28th, as I mentioned. It's going to go through a review, consolidation. There's a selection process that starts right at the beginning of the year, and then we will get into our SIG. And if I leave with one thing, other than going and downloading the hard work that Dan did and other folks did on this new SIG document, this is a member-driven effort. If you haven't been involved, please get involved. If you've already been involved, get involved again. It depends on you and your participation. And with that, thank you. Thank you for your time. Really want to thank Dan for his subject matter expertise, contributions, and everyone else that contributed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.